I lost my memory. David asked me if I remembered who my boyfriend was. I pointed to his younger brother standing behind him. Smirking, David breathed a sigh of relief. But later, on my wedding night with his brother, he went mad, banging on the door. You can't get married. Willow, please come out. Chapter 1. After the doctor said I had lost part of my memory, David came to see me every day. The day before I was discharged, he suddenly asked, Willow, do you remember who your boyfriend is? I looked towards the man sitting in the corner, with a playful smile. David's younger brother, George. Since I was hospitalized, he came to visit me every day. Spoke little, but he definitely matched my taste. My best friend said that before my memory loss, George was pursuing me. So, I pointed at him and said, he is my boyfriend. I don't know if it was just my imagination, but after I said that, David seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. He smiled for the first time in days. Yes, George is your boyfriend. George scoffed, stood up, broad shoulders, narrow waist, and a tall, lean figure, paired with his handsome looks. He was like walking pheromones. I stared at him as he walked towards me. I'll pick you up from the hospital tomorrow, girlfriend. His voice carried a teasing note, full of endless seduction. My face turned red immediately, and I watched his back, feeling my heart race. Willow. I turned around and met David's unhappy gaze. I stopped smiling and asked, why are you still here? David's eyes darkened a bit. I'm getting engaged in a few days, so I can't pick you up from the hospital tomorrow. I waved my hand. Thank you, but my boyfriend will be here. Chapter 2. The next day, George appeared at the hospital right on time. He took my luggage and naturally held my hand. After completing the discharge procedures, he took me home, to his home. He told me my room was the guest bedroom. I saw him go into the master bedroom and couldn't help but ask, aren't we sleeping in the same room? George visibly froze for a moment, then said, looking rather wronged, you didn't want me to sleep in the same room with you. The doctor said I had forgotten a lot of things, and I couldn't remember why I didn't want to share a room with him, but I didn't have the guts to openly say I wanted to sleep with him either. So, I cleared my throat. Let's keep it this way for now. We can talk about it when I recover. He agreed without hesitation, but that handsome smile of his sent a chill down my spine. George went into his room and didn't come out again. When it was time for dinner, he was still nowhere to be seen. I had no choice but to cook. Halfway through, I felt a strong presence behind me. What are you doing? Instinctively, I took a step back. His strong body pressed against my back, the heat from his body seeping through my thin clothes. It was so hot that I dropped the spatula in my hand. I quickly bent down to pick it up, only to have my leg brush against his, fitting perfectly. Before I could react, a pair of strong arms lifted me up and moved me to the other side. Turning around, I only caught a glimpse of George's fleeing back. Though I had forgotten many things, I still had some common sense. Realizing what had just happened, my face and neck turned completely red. When the food was ready, I called him for dinner. He didn't mention anything about the kitchen. Instead, he said, my brother is getting engaged tomorrow, and as my girlfriend, you have to go with me. I nodded. Then, it hit me. Does that mean I'm indirectly meeting your family? George returned to his laid-back attitude. You've already met them. Just be yourself. With that, I felt reassured. Chapter 3. At the engagement banquet, George introduced me to his relatives and friends. I felt a bit uneasy. George, why do I feel like they're looking at me strangely? George smirked. You're too beautiful. They're afraid you'll steal the spotlight from the main character today. I felt a little embarrassed. I had dressed up today, not to outshine his future sister-in-law, but just to avoid embarrassing him. While in the restroom, I overheard a conversation from the next stall. I can't believe David is actually marrying Anna. Just wait until Willow gets her memory back. Who knows what chaos she'll cause? What could she do? David doesn't even love her. If it weren't for her privileged background, do you think David would have let her cling to him for so many years? I saw her with George earlier. Does she think that since she can't get the older brother, she'll go for the younger one? TSK TSK. Even with memory loss, Willow is still such a flirt. Come on, Willow has been good to you guys too. The outside conversation fell silent. I stayed in the stall for a long time. When I came out, I saw George waiting at the door. He looked at me with a playful smile. Were you waiting for me to come find you? I suddenly felt my face heat up. Keep dreaming, he smirked as he took my hand. I think about it all the time. I gave him a light smack on the back of his hand. George, I heard them say that before I lost my memory. I liked your brother. George chuckled. He didn't have that kind of charm. You've always been mine. His fingers brushed against my palm, sending a tingling sensation through me. I pulled my hand away like I had been shocked, but he grabbed it again. Let's go get something to eat. I nodded. George said that before. I used to avoid eating sweets to maintain my figure. I thought that was foolish. So, when David brought his fiancée over to greet us, I had already eaten quite a few desserts. George nonchalantly wiped the corner of my mouth. I grabbed his hand. George, your brother and his fiancée are here. He simply replied with a hum and held my hand, playing with it in front of him. His long, slender fingers brushed against each of mine, as if he had no intention of speaking. The atmosphere grew a little tense. I stood up, raised my glass, and congratulated them on their engagement. David's fiancée, Anna, glanced between George and me several times before she laughed softly and said, "You two seem really close. I hope you'll get engaged soon too." My hand trembled, and I let out a couple of awkward laughs, trying to brush it off. But George, taking it seriously, said, "It's soon. We're already checking the dates." David immediately looked at me. "Is that true, Willow?" I stiffened. "Why yes." David wanted to ask more, but George didn't give him the chance and sent him away. Once we got into the car, George fastened my seatbelt. "How about we go for a drive?" Sure, but I quickly regretted it. As soon as George left the city, he started speeding. I clung to my seatbelt for dear life, not daring to make a sound. Yet George, oblivious to the situation, pressed the gas pedal harder. My entire body was tense, and I was on the verge of tears. If I had known, I wouldn't have gotten in the car with him. We stopped at the seaside, and I rushed out of the car, nearly crying as I vomited. When I turned around, I saw George sitting on the beach, waving at me with a case of beer he had somehow produced. I was in disbelief. "Did you bring me on this wild ride to drink a couple of beers?" He took a swig. "I just thought you might need a drink today." What a rogue. I'm a patient who just got discharged, still on medication, and he suggests drinking? The next second, he laughed. "You can't drink, so I'll do it for you." The consequence of not stopping him was that I had to drive back to the city, bracing myself for the next 2 hours. When we got in the elevator, George stretched out his long arm and pulled me close by the waist. His bewitching face was inches away, with the added allure of intoxication. I stared at him in a daze. George tightened his grip and moved closer. "Willow, am I good looking?" I nodded. "Do you like me?" I nodded again. "Then how about we sleep together tonight?" I nodded once more. Only after nodding did I realize I had fallen into his trap. I blushed with embarrassment. "George, are you really drunk or not?" He lazily rested his head on my shoulder. I tried pushing him away, but he didn't budge. As the elevator door opened, he suddenly bent down and scooped me up, carrying me straight to the master bedroom. I panicked. "George, that's your room." In just a second, George changed direction. "Then we'll go to your room." Without turning on the lights, George put me on the bed and leaned over me. His hand had just slipped under my shirt when the room's lights suddenly flicked on. David stood at the foot of the bed, shouting angrily, "What are you doing?" George was the first to react. He quickly pulled the blanket over me with one hand while his other hand was still inside my shirt. Chapter 4. The corners of George's mouth lifted into a deep smirk. "What do you think we're doing?" David stormed over to pull George away. "Come outside with me." Before letting go, George mischievously gave me a pinch. "Wait for me." George didn't come back. I had barely fallen asleep when I received a call from him. His voice was weak as he told me he was in pain. Only then did I find out that he had been hospitalized. After asking around, I finally learned from my best friend what had happened. After David dragged George away, they got into an argument and ended up fighting. George couldn't hold his own against David and was beaten into the hospital. When I arrived at the hospital, George was lying in bed, groaning. His arms and legs were in casts, his head wrapped in layers of bandages, and there was still a bruise lingering on the corner of his mouth. I was stunned. Did your brother really do all this? George hesitated. Willow, he didn't want me to touch you. I was furious. Even if he is your brother, he's meddling too much. George's eyes lit up with joy. So, does that mean we can continue once I'm better? What are you going to continue? David pushed the door open, and when he saw George, his face darkened immediately. What trouble are you stirring up now? George shrank back, looking like a pitiful victim. I stood in front of George, annoyed. George's brother. You beat him up and now you're here to threaten him too? Believe me, I'll call the police. David frowned. I didn't hit him. After you took him away last night, he ended up in the hospital. If it wasn't you, then who? David's face grew even darker. Willow, he was about to do things to you, and you're still defending him. Do you really want something to happen between you two? I was puzzled. He's my boyfriend. Isn't it normal for something to happen between us? He's not. Ouch. Willow, it hurts. George suddenly spoke up. I immediately asked, what's wrong? Where does it hurt? George pointed to the corner of his mouth. It's time to apply the medicine. Following his instructions, I carefully applied the ointment to his bruise. After the medicine was on, George still said it hurt. I leaned in and gently blew on the corner of his mouth. We were so close that I could see George's eyelashes tremble. His eyes filled with barely concealed joy. Does it still hurt? I asked. George glanced at David and smiled. Yes, it still hurts. I'll blow a little more. When David left, he slammed the hospital room door so hard it shook. Chapter 5. During George's stay in the hospital, I visited him every day. That day, I arrived a bit late due to some errands, and just as I reached the door, I heard voices inside. It was David. He said, Willow will eventually regain her memory, and she'll realize you're faking your illness to deceive her. She hates being lied to the most. George responded nonchalantly. Once she gets her memory back, the first person she won't forgive is you. David clenched his fists. She'll never fall in love with you. George chuckled but didn't say anything more. After David left, I entered the room. As soon as I came in, George acted weak and needed me to feed him. I found it amusing, but I couldn't bring myself to refuse him. After he was discharged, George had his cast removed, but he either clung to the wheelchair or found excuses for me to support him whenever possible. One day, while he was half asleep and got up to drink water, he saw me standing by the fridge. I gave him a playful look. George slowly put the water back and shamelessly pulled me over. I dreamt last night that a master came and cured me. I let him hold me without reacting. George sighed. Forget it. I won't pretend anymore. Haven't I made it obvious enough? Don't you know how I feel? Feigning ignorance, I asked. What feelings? George suddenly laughed, his smile sending chills down my spine. When he laid me on the soft bed, his gaze was so gentle it seemed to drip water. Willow, is this okay? I wrapped my arms around his neck and asked in return, if I said it wasn't, would you stop? No. George was true to his word, and even though I cried out in pain he didn't stop. Afterward, he looked at me like a clueless fool, then said nothing, just held my limp body and helped clean me up. Half asleep, I felt him kissing me over and over again, whispering, Willow, I'm really happy. You belong only to me. You'll belong to me for the rest of your life. After that night, George became particularly clingy. Outside, he never let go of my hand, and at home, he practically wanted to hang me around his neck. I felt a bit overwhelmed. George, don't you think you're being too clingy? George played with my hair, leaned in, and took a breath. Do you hate me clinging to you? No, I don't. George chuckled, cupped my chin, and kissed me. I was startled and pressed my hand against his chest. George, we just finished an hour ago. He nibbled on my earlobe, mumbling, "It's been an hour since we had any deep communication. Isn't that too frequent?" Frequent? I thought anything less than 24 hours a day was too little. Please, stop talking. Chapter 6. Lately, I've been feeling weak from all his teasing, and I'm sleeping longer and longer. George finally realized things couldn't continue like this, so he started taking me to hang out with his friends. At the entrance of the club, George received a call and had to take care of something, so he told me to wait for him in the private room. Be good. I'll be there soon. As I was about to push open the door to the room, I unexpectedly heard my name from inside. Willow is just David's worn-out plaything, isn't she? George is such a fool for not minding that. David had better taste. He dumped her while she had amnesia. Otherwise, how many times would she have cheated on him after marriage? But seriously, Willow's figure is something else. If George hadn't gotten to her first, I definitely would have had a go at her. That's enough. She's still a woman David used to be with. Show him some respect. Right, David? After a long pause, David's voice came through. That depends on when she gets her memory back and comes crawling back to me. I clenched my fists, ready to storm in and confront them, but someone beat me to it. I barely caught a glimpse of a shadow rushing inside, followed by the sounds of screams and pleas for mercy. Not far away, I saw security guards and staff rushing over, but I stopped them at the door. It's just the brothers sparring. Don't disturb them. Luckily, they didn't doubt me, and they all left. I waited outside the door for a long time until the noise stopped. The door finally opened, and a furious George walked out, grabbed my hand, and led me outside. As we left the club, David came after us. His face was bruised, and he looked disheveled. Willow, just because you lost your memory doesn't mean you can erase the fact that we were once together. George's face darkened, ready to make another move, but I pulled him behind me. David, I don't know why I liked you before I lost my memory, but you're no good either. You know better than anyone whether or not anything actually happened between us. David stiffened for a moment, but quickly regained his composure. You should worry about yourself. The Liu family won't let you marry in. George's wedding is already set, and the ceremony is next month. I froze, slowly turning toward George. George averted his eyes. David sneered. Looks like George didn't tell you. Then again, who would take a shameless woman like you seriously? Chapter 7. I don't know how I made it home. George didn't come after me. By the time my best friend, Roma, called, I had already been lying in bed for 3 days. When she rushed over and saw the state I was in, she was shocked. Goodness, what did you do to yourself? She touched my forehead and quickly pulled her hand back from the heat. You're burning up. I'm taking you to the hospital. Roma, was I really a terrible person before? Why is everyone treating me this way? Roma cupped my face. Sweetie, you weren't bad at all. If they don't like you, that's their problem, not yours. Believe me, if someone truly loves you, there's no way they wouldn't notice you're pretending. I was confused. Is that really true? It is. You always knew how to take care of yourself. You can't ruin your health over some jerk. With Roma insisting, I went to the hospital with her. After a checkup, they said it was pneumonia, and I had to be admitted. Maybe it was because of the prolonged fever, but I spent most of the next few days asleep, in a hazy state. I had many dreams. In the dreams, I was often excluded for being too pretty, and during my school years, there were always rumors about me. I never bothered to clear them up. So over time, I gained a reputation for being a bad girl who changed boyfriends every month. As I grew older, David pursued me, and thinking he could help block some unwanted attention. I agreed, but David wasn't a good person either. He constantly tried to trick me into bed. When I refused and wanted to break up with him, he went so far as to tamper with my brakes, causing the car accident that led to my memory loss. After the accident, he wasted no time slandering me, claiming I had been clinging to him. He even rushed into an engagement arranged by his family. When I opened my eyes again, I felt clear-headed. Roma was the only one by my bedside. My sweetie, you finally woke up. You were talking nonsense while you had that fever. I was worried you'd forget about me too. I gave a small smile. Even if I forget everyone else, I wouldn't forget you. Roma gaped at me, staring in surprise. She hesitantly asked, "So, you remember everything?" I nodded. Roma wiped away a tear and angrily started recounting what had happened in the past few days. She said both David and George had come by. David didn't even make it through the door before she chased him away with curses. George, however, had snuck in while she was out, and she had beaten him out the door. I smiled, my eyes crinkling. Thank goodness you were here. But, sweetie, I think George looked pretty upset. Is there something you two need to clear up? I fell silent. Before my memory loss, George had pursued me too, even after I got together with David. His looks toward me were never innocent. During the time I lost my memory, he didn't seem to be faking anything, but now he's about to get married. What's the point of bringing this up? Roma, I'm leaving the country. So suddenly? It wasn't really sudden. The plans had been made before I lost my memory, but everything had been delayed. Chapter 8. On the day I left, Roma came to see me off. She hugged me and cried, telling me to take good care of myself. I sighed. I'm just going to study. I'll be back. Before I turned off my phone, I got a message from Roma. George is chasing after you. I didn't reply. I deleted the message and shut off my phone. Life abroad was a routine of school and home, but it was fulfilling. Occasionally, when I was too exhausted to keep pushing forward, I'd think about the days I spent with George. As much as I hated to admit it, those days were the happiest of my life. If I calculated correctly, the date of his wedding should be near. I picked up my phone, thinking of texting Roma, but after typing and deleting several times, I chose to stay silent. Roma must have sensed it too, because she called me the day before George's wedding. George is getting married tomorrow. Willow, are you really not going to try one last time? I didn't know how to answer. What George and I had become a joke in our circles. If I went to win him back, under what title would I do it? Roma continued. I saw George at a party with my dad not long ago. He seemed like a completely different person, so much more mature. If it weren't for his face, I wouldn't have recognized him. I just feel like, if you two let this go, it'll become your biggest regret. I mumbled something vague and changed the subject. That night, I couldn't sleep, and I aimlessly scrolled through my phone. For some reason, I opened the ticketing app, but then I remembered the way George had avoided my eyes that day, and it was like a bucket of cold water had been poured over me. I quickly exited the app. I didn't sleep all night and went for an early morning run. When I opened the door, I saw him sitting there, startled by the noise. He stood up immediately, his eyes filled with sorrow as he looked at me. It was like lightning had struck me. What are you doing here? George's hair was disheveled, and his tailored suit was wrinkled. He didn't say a word for a long time, just stared at me. The first thing he said was, "I haven't eaten in 2 days." Under my shocked gaze, he walked into my apartment and went straight to the bathroom. It was as if he had always lived here. I stood outside the bathroom door, unsure of what to do. After a long time, George's weak voice called out from inside, "Willow, I'm really hungry." I couldn't just let him starve, so I went to the kitchen and cooked him some noodles. By the time he came out, the food was ready. He was wearing my bathrobe, his damp hair falling lazily over his forehead, adding a touch of casual charm. His muscles, exposed to the air, were perfectly toned, inviting dangerous thoughts. He didn't say anything, just picked up the bowl and ate. In a few quick bites, he had finished the large bowl of noodles. I quietly went to collect the dishes, but he grabbed my hand. "Willow, I've really missed you." His eyes, usually filled with mischief, were now full of sorrow, and I felt that if I looked too long, I'd be drawn in. I looked away, coldly pulling my hand free. "If you're full, then leave." He awkwardly moved around the coffee table, trying to block my path. "Willow, I know I was wrong. Please, just listen to my explanation, okay?" Chapter 9. I struggled a little, and George's grip on my wrist tightened, holding back my temper. I said, "All right, explain." George raised his handsome face, a hint of grievance in his eyes. My family wanted me to return for an arranged marriage, But I refused. That day, I didn't expect David to be there. It was him who told my father where I was. Remember when I went to take a phone call? That was my father giving me an ultimatum, using you to threaten me. I originally ran after you. But David, that bastard, knocked me out. Willow, I didn't know how to explain it to you at the time, so I didn't say anything right away. Can you please not be mad anymore? I knew that most people in our circle couldn't escape the fate of arranged marriages, but I never thought George would become one of the pawns. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. George moved a little closer, and I could smell the familiar scent of his body wash. I ran away. Willow, don't send me away, please? I suddenly realized that today was supposed to be his wedding day. Yet here he was. I was about to ask when my phone rang. It was David. I glanced at George, and his thin, beautiful lips pressed together tightly. I answered the call and put it on speaker. David, with no sense of courtesy, immediately started questioning. Where are you hiding George? Willow, even if you like him, it doesn't matter. He's a child of the Liu family. Unless he leaves the family for good, he'll never be able to marry you. The Liu family doesn't need a woman who's both unclean and lacks any background. I laughed. David, you've lied so much that you've even started believing yourself. Should I announce to the world what you did while you were chasing me? There was silence on the other end. Then I saw that he had hung up the phone. I put the phone aside and looked at George. George's eyes were wide in shock. And after a moment, he lowered his head in disappointment. You remember everything now, don't you? I didn't deny it. George dropped his usual playful demeanor, slumping with defeat. Then, I guess I shouldn't bother you anymore. He went to change back into his dirty clothes. As he walked out, he kept looking back every few steps. George, I called him. He turned around, barely able to hide the hope in his eyes. I pointed to the trash near the door. Take the trash out for me, will you? His once expressive eyes immediately dulled. After he left, I got a call from Roma. Did George go to your place? Yeah, Roma gasped. I knew I wasn't wrong. George ran away from his wedding, and his father is furious. He's practically chasing him down. Me, he's not here anymore. What? No way. Where else could he go? He begged me for your address, practically forcing it out of me. Roma's voice trailed off, and she quickly changed the subject. I'll apologize to you properly when you get back. I gave a half-hearted smile. So, you sold me out, huh? Roma suddenly grew serious. I just think George is perfect for you. You were like a completely different person when you were with him. Trust me, sweetie, he's your destined one. I don't know if he's my destined one. But it wasn't long before I saw George again. He had become my neighbor. Chapter 10. At first, I ignored George as much as possible, but George didn't seem to notice my attitude. Every morning, he would be waiting at my door when I left, holding my favorite Chinese breakfast. In the evenings, he would be sitting in the stairwell, waiting for me to come home. If I hadn't taken the breakfast in the morning, when I saw him in the evening, he would have both breakfast and dinner with him. At first, I could ignore him, but as time passed, the other students in the apartment building started noticing. Everyone knew about my connection to George, and he told anyone who asked that we were in a quarrel and he was trying to win my forgiveness. Sometimes, friends who were closer to me would speak on his behalf, to avoid hearing about him constantly. I had no choice but to accept the meals he prepared for me each day. But George pushed his luck further, sneaking little notes into the bags. His drawings were terrible. The stick figures were ridiculously ugly, and the flowers were all crooked and lopsided. When I mentioned it to Roma, she burst out laughing. George is that bad at drawing? I never would have guessed. I laughed too. Roma said, you've tested him enough by now. If you wait any longer, someone else might snatch him away, and then you'll regret it. Yeah, I know. In these days, I'd gathered a lot of information, and it was just as George had said. He had been threatened. It wasn't like he was completely blameless, but it wasn't entirely his fault either. I thought about it for an entire night and decided to forgive him the next day. But that morning, I waited for a long time, and George didn't show up. A student from the apartment across the way told me that George had left in the middle of the night. I felt a chill run through me. Did he say where he was going? He left with a woman. Said he was going back to prepare for his wedding. Chapter 11. My life returned to its usual calm. But in that calm, it felt like something was missing. Every time I passed by the stairwell, I would instinctively glance at the apartment where George had lived. But the handsome nobleman was nowhere to be seen. I wanted to message Roma, but I was afraid of hearing news of his wedding. And so, 2 weeks passed. The area around the apartment had become unsafe, with several incidents of stalking. The women living nearby often walked home in groups, leaving no chance for criminals to strike. That day, I was delayed by something, and by the time I reached the meeting point, everyone had already left. On the dark street, I hurried towards the apartment. As I walked, I heard footsteps behind me, following close. At that moment, 1,000 ways to die flashed through my mind. I forced myself to stay calm, reaching for the pepper spray in my bag. When someone tapped me on the shoulder, I quickly turned to spray the person behind me, but I was a step too late. The person had been prepared, and I missed. As I was dragged towards a dark alley, I thought, if I survive this, I'll do whatever it takes to be with George. Perhaps someone heard my thoughts, because someone arrived. The attacker was pulled deeper into the alley, and I was enveloped in a warm, strong embrace. A familiar voice whispered in my ear, "It's okay. Don't be scared. It's over now." When I listened closely, I realized that the voice was trembling uncontrollably. It took me a moment to look up, but once I confirmed it was George, I threw myself into his arms, sobbing. George carried me home. I clung to him, refusing to let go, afraid that if I did, he would disappear again. George, half amused and half exasperated, said, "I'm not going anywhere. Even if you chase me away, I won't leave. But I do need to clean up. Want to join me?" I nodded instinctively. George carried me into the bathroom but darted out at the last minute. After we had both washed up, I lay in bed, and George lay next to me, his voice still filled with fear. "I was only gone for 2 weeks, and this is how you take care of yourself." His words made the memory of the night rush back, and I shuddered with fear. I tried to hold it in, but I couldn't stop myself from asking, "Is this how you chase after someone?" After just a few days, you ran back to prepare for a wedding. Was it fun to play with me? George looked confused. "What wedding?" I repeated what the student had told me. George's expression was hard to describe. "That woman was my mom. She came to take me back for David's wedding." What? George shook his head with an amused sigh. "Anna's pregnant, so they moved the wedding up. Didn't you hear?" I shook my head. Roma hadn't mentioned anything to me. George's eyes narrowed, as if he had discovered something, and he looked at me with a mischievous grin. "Are you jealous?" "Me? No. Really? So, it's fine if I go back and agree to my family's arranged marriage?" I pinched him hard on the waist. "You wouldn't dare." George gasped, his long arms snaking around my waist as his warm lips began to trail down my skin. "Willow, I missed you so much." His rough fingers traced up my waist, sending shivers through me. I responded to him cautiously. His breath hitched, and in return, his touch became even more heated. Maybe it had been too long since we were last together, but George had no sense of restraint and kept going all night. Afterward, we talked, and George suggested I return home with him, but I refused. "I like you, but I love myself more. I won't give up my goals for anything." It was as if George hadn't heard the second half of my sentence, and he repeatedly asked, "You said you like me? Did Willow say she likes me? Did I hear that right?" Then he kept pestering me to repeat the words. I refused, so he continued teasing me. When I finally fell asleep, exhausted, I heard George whisper in my ear, "Willow, I love you." The day I sent George off at the airport, he clung to me, demanding a kiss. I covered my swollen lips, refusing to let him near. George leaned in close, whispering in my ear, "It's fine. You're graduating in a year. When you come back, we'll get married." At the mention of marriage, his eyes sparkled with a mischievous glint. The same one he had when he told me he had learned a new trick. Blushing, I shooed him away. But once he was really gone, it felt like something was missing from my heart. Chapter 12. A year later, I returned after completing my studies. George's assistant came to pick me up at the airport. When I asked about George, the assistant was brief. Mr. Liu just took over the Liu group. He's been incredibly busy lately. I was surprised. He took over the Liu group? The assistant said. You can ask Mr. Liu about the details. I couldn't get much information from the assistant, but I was curious, so I decided to ask Roma. However, Roma was busy with something and hadn't replied to my messages. The assistant drove me to George's place, which was still the same as before. I dropped my luggage in the guest room, freshened up, and sent George a message, telling him I was going to nap off the jet lag. I didn't know how long I slept, but when I woke up, I felt a warm body wrapped around me. I opened my eyes to see George's smiling face. Did you sleep well? I stretched lazily in his arms. When did you get back? Now that you're awake, it's my turn. Startled, I quickly grabbed his wandering hands. George, it's still daylight. I don't care. Aren't you busy? George's voice was husky. A couple of hours won't make a difference. Me, 3 hours later, exhausted and curled up in his arms. I muttered. You said 2 hours. George chuckled, clearly in a good mood. Next time, I'll let you go over the time limit. That evening, George called me to get up for dinner. I ate 2 full bowls of rice before finally having the energy to ask about his company. He explained that David had lost 3 major projects, leaving the shareholders disappointed. Around the same time, George secured several big deals, rising to the top, and eventually taking over the position. I stared at him. George, tell me honestly, did you do something to David? George didn't confirm or deny it. Are you afraid of me? No, you should have done this a long time ago. You're smarter than him. George gave me a sideways glance. I've always been smarter than him. It felt like there was a deeper meaning behind his words, but I couldn't quite figure out what it was. Chapter 13. George suggested taking me to meet his family. I was nervous. What if they don't agree? George looked relaxed. Don't worry, don't forget. You're the daughter of the Lee family, the sole heir to the Lee group. I blushed. I've been hiding this from you for so long. Aren't you upset? My parents had been worried I'd meet someone with bad intentions, so they made me keep my family background a secret. For safety, they even gave me a simple, ordinary identity. That's why even David hadn't known my true identity. George half-joked. It's a good thing no one knew who you really were. Otherwise, I wouldn't have had a chance. You're not so bad yourself. George, still teasing, leaned in. Which part do you mean? Me, at the Liu family's old mansion. George held my hand as we walked in, only to run into David and Anna. David's brow furrowed deeply. George, you really brought her here. Anna looked me up and down with disdain. That's right. George, you're the heir to the company now. Our parents won't allow a woman without power or status to marry into the family. George's voice was calm but firm. I've secured my position without relying on a woman. There was a deeper meaning to his words. Sure enough, David's face turned pale with anger. This isn't over yet. Just wait. George ignored him, leading me inside. At the dinner table, George's parents weren't exactly warm toward me. After the meal, George's father called him to the study for a conversation. When he came out, his father's attitude had completely changed. He warmly asked how my studies abroad had gone. I answered all his questions. After a bit of conversation, he brought up our marriage, asking if they could come over tomorrow to formally propose. David couldn't believe it. Dad, didn't you say there's no way you'd let her into the family? How dare you speak like that? This isn't your place to talk. David, unwilling to back down, was about to say more when George calmly stated, I've already spoken with Mr. Lee. He's more than happy to entrust his daughter to me. David, Mr. Lee? Daughter? You mean Lee Group, the leading company in our city? George, that's right. David looked at me, then at George, too shocked to speak. That night, after we left, news broke that Anna had miscarried. George told me that after we left, David and Anna had a fight. In a moment of frustration, David admitted that if Anna hadn't been pregnant, he wouldn't have married her, he would have married me instead. Enraged, Anna confessed that the child wasn't his. David hit her, and that's how she lost the baby. I sighed, but I couldn't bring myself to feel sympathy. After all, it was David's choice. What I didn't expect was that David would still come looking for me. He stopped me outside my company, holding a large bouquet of roses. He happily offered them to me. Willow, happy birthday. I didn't take them. Throughout our time together, David had never gotten me a gift, not even for my birthday. Even when he was pursuing me, he never spent a dime on me aside from basic dates. But now, after learning about my true identity, he suddenly changed and brought me flowers. When he saw that I wasn't taking them, he casually tossed them aside. If you don't like roses, that's fine. I can take you to pick out something else. David, I'm your sister-in-law. David's face stiffened, but he quickly regained his composure. Are you trying to say I'm already married? That's fine. I've already drafted the divorce papers. Besides, you and George aren't married yet, right? I held up my left hand, showing him my wedding ring. Actually, we got married this morning. David's mouth fell open. How is that possible? I smiled. My husband is coming to pick me up. Goodbye. David blocked my path again. Willow, you remember everything now, right? So you must remember that we were once together. How can you be with my brother after being with me? Because I love him, I said softly, without waiting to see his reaction. I walked straight toward George. Chapter 14. George, worried that David might cause trouble, decided to hold the wedding as soon as possible. At the wedding, David sat in the audience with a face like ash. Around him, there were whispers and pointed fingers. See that? That's David. I heard he looked down on the Lee family's heiress and dumped her when she lost her memory. TSK. Who would have thought? He looks decent, but does such despicable things. I also heard he's getting a divorce. But the Meng family isn't easy to deal with. They've got dirt on him, and his life is going to be rough from now on. I have to say, today's couple looks stunning. Does the bride have any sisters? Don't even think about it. The bride is the only daughter of the Lee family. George hit the jackpot this time. After the wedding, George left the guests behind and took me back to our new home. As soon as we got inside, he pinned me against the door. Blushing, I tried to push him away. What if they notice we're missing? You should be worried about me, wife. I haven't seen you in 3 days. His hand slid under my wedding dress. You were too stunning today. From the moment I saw you, I wanted to do this. You rogue. Be good. Tonight, I'll show you what a rogue really is. With a light tug of his slender fingers, my wedding dress fell to the floor, and his heated body pressed against mine. At the same time, there was a knock on the door. Outside, David's voice rang out, frantic. You can't get married. Willow, come out. I bit my lip, whispering, George, let's go to the bedroom. This spot is perfect. The knocking grew louder, as if David was about to tear the door down. David shouted, you were with me first. How can you marry him? Willow, come out, please. Inside, I bit down so hard that my lips started to bleed. It wasn't until David was dragged away that George finally carried my limp body into the bedroom. Wife, the night is long. You better enjoy yourself. Chapter 15. When the Liu family parents found out about David's disruption at the wedding, George's father, furious, sent him to Africa. Anna not only didn't divorce him, but she also followed him there. 2 years later, I gave birth to a pair of twins, and then I returned to take over the family business. George, too worried about the kids, brought them to the office and became a full-time dad. During meetings, George would video call me, holding one baby in each arm. Wife, the kids miss you. I smiled. I'll come home early tonight. But when I got home, there was no one there except George. Seeing the triumphant smirk on his face, I angrily threw a pillow at him. George, you tricked me again. George pulled me into his arms, inhaling deeply. Wife, It's been so long since we've had time for just the two of us. Ever since the kids were born, my mind had been focused on them. And with taking over the company, I had neglected George. So, I couldn't bring myself to turn him down. The consequence of indulging him was that, the next month, the test showed 2 lines. I was on the verge of tears. George, are you trying to kill me? Don't worry, sweetie. I'll go get a vasectomy tomorrow. Yeah, right.